and I'll put that back. More people turn that on. That's right. That's going to be your mic. So yeah, I think I may come back. Sure. Yeah. Standing in front of a packed house, putting out chairs as Alan Tuten is going to speak. How are you? Everybody quieted down. Must be 7 o'clock. Must be 7 o'clock because you all stopped talking. Welcome into the Lincoln Parish Museum and Historical Society. A continuing Chautauqua series that we're putting on here. The second Renaissance has begun for this place and this space, the Lincoln Parish Museum and Historical Society. We're streaming live right now. If you all would be so kind, follow us on Facebook. That's how we're going to kind of share information as we grow. Let's create a remarkable future. And so the Chautauqua series is it's a talk, and you're going to learn some information. We'll have a talk back as well. And a matter of fact, we haven't worked out the details, but you gave a Chautauqua, by the way, and her brochures are here. Who was in the house for that talk that night? You learned some information that you never knew before, but I think date in May somewhere, right? Oh, June. Okay. Post Peach Fest? Good. This is a sesquicentennial sanctioned event. That means that Lincoln Parish is celebrating 150 years. I have some really encouraging news. Alan Green, founder of Lincoln Parish, and his wife Mahala, their cemetery is out at Pecan Orchard Road, somewhere out there. It's sustained some damage. Which it's past still number 3, and you turn right, okay, white lightning. But anyway, there was damage from natural on his tombstones, and John Brown in the back, I know you're not asking for it, thank you so much. John Brown Monument said, look, I do that kind of work, I'm going to get up there. You're going to see photographs of before and after. So it's just indicative of the second Renaissance of the creating a remarkable future. Thank you so much for doing that. On this, Alan Green. Okay. From one Alan to another, I'll let Alan Tuten, it's a Tuten Tuesday. And I want to also let you know, in the back room, we have plenty of coloring books, Louisiana Archaeology, provided by the State Office of Cultural Recreation. As you need, plus another neat thing, it is a Indian Mounds of Northeast Louisiana driving trail guide. These are all free. Pick up 1, pick up 20. I got boxes. I don't want them. Let's get them out into the community. Alan Tuten, when I called him, where is Benny? He approached me, and I'm open to new ideas to create relevancy for this place and space. What does that mean? I don't know. You tell me. Benny said, have you ever thought about the Indian artifacts that you have in this building? How about having Alan Tuten come on? It's a great idea. Alan Tuten's here. He said yes. So that's how we create. So if you have any ideas, please get them to me, and let's make this happen. So Alan, thank you so much for your time, and the floor is yours, my friend.
Okay, thank you. I know but I do have some. Lifelong interest. This is not original research. There are a number of articles and books. One book in particular that I enjoyed reading and got some of the information for tonight. It's called The Cattle and Their Ancestors, and we'll talk about more about that in a few minutes. Another Americans, and this one is a really good that have been written by individuals that are pretty knowledgeable in the field. And, copies of that. So again, I have gleaned information from others who have written, who have studied and done archaeological work, and just in talking to individuals that I consider to be friends and also like to collect as well. One, I'll point out, Jim Hatch over here, there's no telling how many miles Jim Hatch and I walked up and down rows of fields when we were in high school looking for artifacts and talking about them, comparing them, and that sort of thing. But my goal tonight is to help you appreciate the survival skills that the ancestors of our land developed and how they used these natural resources available. Someone I was talking to coming in the room, may have been Truman or somebody, we're talking about, you know, they did not have the local Walmart or Lowe's to go to for a tool. If they wanted a tool, they had to figure out how to make it and how to use it. So often, but again, keep in mind the goal is to learn to appreciate what these ancient people did to survive. When we think of the early inhabitants, most often related to stories or movies that we've seen on the big screen or television about the Apaches, the Comanches, the Sioux, the Navajo, and others. And actually, tribes existed from the East Coast to the West Coast. We could spend days trying to discuss all of the Indians in North America, but I just want to give a brief overview of some of the historical part of that, and then focus on North Louisiana and even on Lincoln Parish. It's generally believed that the earliest inhabitants in North America arrived by way of Asia from the Bering Sea around 12,000 BC. That means about 14,000 years ago. By 6,000 BC, about 1 million inhabitants had scattered throughout North and South America in the tribes. Okay, granted, that's 6,000 years, but they had come all the way from northern part of Alaska all the way into South America and scattered throughout North America as well. It is generally believed that the earliest inhabitants of North America arrived, again, about 12,000 BC. Through radiocarbon dating analysis, it is believed the earliest inhabitants in Louisiana came around 11,000 BC, 13,000 years ago. And that's referred to as the Paleolithic period. The following years divided into the Archaic period, and actually those, the Archaic period is divided into early, middle, and late Archaic, but we're not going into that detail. But roughly the Archaic period lasted from about 8,000 BC to 1,000 BC, followed by periods called the Woodland, Mississippian, and Historic. These are significant, there are significant archaeological sites in each of these cultural periods I mentioned in Louisiana. And I mentioned those only to note that the first cultural appearance of several items, and I will show some of those here a little later. One thing very prevalent, and Rick mentioned it about the mounds in Louisiana. The first mounds were built about 3000 BC. Pottery was made starting about 500 BC. The bow and arrow not until 600 AD, in the woodland period. This means that Indians lived without the bow and arrow for over 11,000 years. And that's hard to kind of comprehend because our general thought is we associate Indians with the bow and arrow. Well, they were here for 11,000 years before they ever came about the use of a bow and arrow.
They must have gotten along well.
Corn and other crops did not appear as part of the culture until 1000 AD in the Mississippian period. The people in the Archaic period lived strictly by hunting and fishing and gathering. They did make a few stone tools. These were thought to have been in small groups and highly mobile. They did not range widely in Louisiana, but moved to find better game and foraging for food. During the Archaic period, it is likely that some groups formed larger communities consisting of multiple descent groups that later developed into tribes. Throughout the various periods, the Indians were very resourceful. Survival depended on hunting and gathering food and so much more. They made shelters from the weather, basic tools and clothing. In addition to stone tools, they extensively used antler, bone, fiber, and animal skins. They had an immense knowledge of plants that could be useful for medicinal purposes. And just as a personal example, in more of a modern time, Maribel and I were in Belize, 20 years ago maybe? But anyway, some time back, and in the town we were asking about some jungle tour or walk or whatever, and someone referred us to a man, and I can't even remember the name, I'm going to say Fallow, said, go down this dirt road to the end and ask for Fallow. We went to the dirt road and we saw this gentleman there and asked, can you tell us where Fallow is? And he said, I'm Fallow. So we said, can you take us into the jungle and show us some things? That guy was amazing. I mean, every step or two he would stop and say, see this plant? You can grind it up and use it for this. See this plant? You know, if you have a runny nose, you burn it and sniff this. And I mean, he went through thing after thing, or roots or whatever. And this was the very thing that these Navy inhabitants learned to use in order to survive. They had their own pharmacy, Truman, if you will, and it was out in the woods. By the later part of the Archaic period, American Indians in some parts of northwest Louisiana began to live for extended periods in one area where food was plentiful. This is evidenced by larger concentrations of artifact material in a particular area. If you are on a creek bank or a field and you find just a few things, you know that this was just maybe a week or two, an overnight stay or whatever. But if you find lots of broken pottery, lots of flint chips, you find fire pits where there's other things, evidence there, you know that they did live there for a little bit longer period of time. Also in the late Archaic period, the mound builders gave us some evidence of more permanent village sites, although they were still hunter-gatherers. Louisiana has more than 800 archaeological sites with mounds. Do you know of any other state that has more? Louisiana has more mound archaeological sites than any other state in the Union. Yes, even Lincoln Parish has a mound. One of the largest and earliest mounds is called Watson Break, located on the Washita River, just on the south side of Monroe or West Monroe. The best known mound is called Poverty Point, located near Epps. It's about an hour's drive from here, a little bit north of Delhi. In its time, it was the largest earthwork site in the Western Hemisphere. It was constructed at the same time as Stonehenge was being constructed in England, or about 3,500 years ago. Poverty Point was a ceremonial center that was once home to thousands of people, as well as a trading hub unmatched by any North American location at the time. It was supported, and this is supported by many stone tools whose origin is found in the Midwest or southeastern part of the United States. In other words, they were trading. They were coming through here. I know there's some stuff from the Ohio area, Kentucky area, found stone type material in Poverty Point, also further east. And so there was quite a trade going on, and Poverty Point was the very center of that. Hard to believe that at that point in time, that was probably the largest metropolitan city in North America. Those who lived in Poverty Point left no written records, but did leave millions of artifacts behind. Those artifacts provide clues about the people who lived their daily lives there, but many details remain a mystery. You'll notice I put emphasis on clues. We just use those and kind of put some pieces together and think we know how they were used and what they were doing. These and most other mounds were not burial mounds, as many people think. They were used for other special purposes. They were ceremonial in most cases, and in some cases also to build houses on a higher elevation to prevent flooding. Incredibly, Poverty Point inhabitants were not farmers. Only the natural bounty of some of the richest land and water in North America could feed such a large settlement of people living solely off the land. And again, no one knows what happened to this once thriving metropolitan city. Remains a mystery. I will show and demonstrate some of the Poverty Point artifacts when I finish with this part of the presentation. Fast forward to about 800 AD, and we begin to see more small village groups joining together in loose alliances or cultures. Generally, they were in the same language group. Whereas, there may be 3 or 4 different tribes, but spoke a similar language, and so they were grouped into a culture. To our east, we had the Coles Creek culture along the Mississippi River and included much of northeast Louisiana. To the west, the Caddo culture covered a large area in northwest Louisiana and parts of East Texas and even into Oklahoma. North central Louisiana was in the middle and maybe had some overlapping from both cultures. From pottery style identification, I personally feel we were a little more closely associated with the Caddo. On some of the sites, you'll find evidence of occupation from ancestral to historical times. These sites were not continuously occupied. Remember, we're talking about 11,000 years to 11,000 BC to 800 AD. Doesn't mean that someone lived there for 12,000 years. It means that, hey, this is a good place to settle and build a house. There's a lot of fish here, there's a lot of deer here, and maybe they in and out of there for several hundred years. A few thousand years ago, someone else moved in. So we find a mixture of architectural or type buildings and different types of stone, and we can identify, though, the different periods that were lived there by looking at the design and shape of some of the, particularly the projectile points. Within each culture, there were several identified tribes living in a smaller geographic area within the boundaries of that culture. In the Coles Creek culture in northeast Louisiana were the Washita and Natchez tribes. From the Caddo in northwest Louisiana were Caddo, Natchitoches, Yahtzee, AD tribes, and some places the Washita are even placed in the Caddo culture too because of some language similarities. Again, you can look at some of the archaeological maps and you'll see someone will draw the curve here and someone may have it a little bit over here, but because we don't have exact written history or knowledge of that. And also, I say Coles Creek to the east and Caddo to the west, they may not have both been formed in the same year. There may have been 50 or 100 years more difference, but generally speaking, these were the two cultures that were more associated with North Louisiana in this latest period. This information that we do have about these tribes that I mentioned, the Natchitoches, the Yahtzee, the AD, and the Caddo, that came mostly from the Spanish and French explorers in our area 300 to 400 years ago. They mapped and journaled their exploration and details about each tribe they encountered. After the Louisiana Purchase, early American policies obscured that tribal diversity in various land treaties that were imposed. As a result, many were moved or forced to move further west into Texas and Oklahoma as they were pushed from their land by the European settlers. I have seen maps that the French in particular had drawn, talking about going up the Red River and noting each bend of the river or where the village was and the name of that village and dates. So they did a really good job of giving us a little history maybe 300 or 400 years ago. In both of the North Louisiana cultures, tribal life was similar. There's evidence of corn, squash, and pumpkins being cultivated. Homes were made of poles sunk into the ground in a circular form and covered with a mixture of clay and grass, not teepees. The roof was made of some type of thatching material. Palmetto leaves were commonly used. A good example can be found on the south side of Natchez, Mississippi. There's easy access to a recreated village built in this style. Both were mound builders, although the Coles Creek tribe along the Mississippi River mounds were more numerous. We've seen evidence of this, of how these homes were constructed. Some of the more professional archaeological work where they would dig down to a level and they would find dark circles, maybe circles this big around, and a circular pattern, which would let us to believe those were poles that were sunk into the ground, and the darker spots were where the wood had rotted and decayed many years ago. While isolated in small groups, they somehow managed to travel and trade with other tribes several hundred miles away. Some of the stone tools and arrow points were made from local material. Others have been found that came from states quite some distance away, such as novaculite found in Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. I brought a piece of novaculite. This is out of a quarry in Arkansas, just south of Hot Springs. It has a quality that chips and flakes pretty easily, and so it was sought after as a material for making tools, stone tools. They always pick places to settle near a stream or river on ground not likely to flood. Every place I've ever found artifacts, this is the case too. Many village sites have been discovered along the Red and Washita rivers in North Louisiana. Dugout log canoes were used for transportation on these rivers. Remnants of logs have been found in recent years as high water eroded the banks of the Red River. You may have read about these. Some were found in the last 5 or 10 years, I think. Village site evidence has been found along any tributary of these rivers in North Louisiana. D'Arbonne is a perfect example. I have found artifact evidence at least a dozen different places along D'Arbonne. There are a number of them covered up by Lake Claiborne. That area of D'Arbonne, village sites all along there when the water is down or before the lake was built. And even as it goes on through Lincoln and Union parishes, I've found artifacts, an arrowhead or pottery at maybe 4 or 5 other sites along D'Arbonne. So must have been a good area to hunt and fish and live. Even the smaller streams that are in our area, and I'm drilling down into Lincoln Parish now, such as Cypress Creek, Stowe Creek, Big Creek, all in Lincoln Parish, evidence of the village site has been found. I know several different ones of you have talked to me coming in and mentioned that you have found in years before artifacts in certain places along some of these very creeks, and I have as well. The most common evidence found is broken pottery, usually called pottery shards, flint chips from flaking stone to make a tool, burned hickory nut shells, mussel shells, scrapers, and arrowheads. Many artifacts have been found in plowed fields near these water sources, others by digging and sifting. I've come to appreciate this latter method should be done by professionals. If the ground has not been previously plowed in order to preserve the historical value of what was found. At any boat landing, I always look at the edge of the water for some artifact. Several boat landings on D'Arbonne have produced an arrowhead for me. Gill's Ferry, you know what Gill's Ferry is? I picked one up at Gill's Ferry a couple of years ago. The Alabama Landing on the Washita River is a very productive village site. In search of artifacts, in all my years of looking, I probably walked several hundred miles up and down rows of a plowed field. Jim Hatch and I used to run cross country together in high school, and we probably walked fields more miles than we ran cross country in that time in high school. The best time to look is after a fresh plowing and a hard rain. I once went up to an area outside of Sterlington on the Washita River, and I promise you, it was only 2 or 3 hours after a hard rain, and I thought, oh good, I'm gonna get here, I'm gonna find all kind of stuff. You know what I found up and down those rows? Boot prints. Somebody must have gone there in the rain looking. But on a lot of these trips, I've been solo other than with Jim, but I have taken family members with me, different ones several times, but no one's ever gone back a second time, if that tells you something too. I have done some sifting in Lincoln, Jackson, and Union parishes, probably enough to fill a couple of dump trucks, one shovel at a time. The best I've ever had was in the bend of an old dry creek bed near Spearsville, where much material had been washed and settled in the bend of this old creek. In the time frame of 200 to 800 years ago, village life was spent hunting, fishing, tending small crops, making or replacing tools, cooking, building and repairing huts, and maybe occasionally some fun and games. If you find an artifact such an arrowhead, treasure it as a special piece of history created by an amazing craftsman. But be cautious in purchasing artifacts. There are many fakes out there, especially in tourist areas. I've learned a little about the art of flint knapping, but am careful not to contaminate my own collection. I personally found by walking and done the sifting. I like a show and tell presentation. So now I'd like to take a little bit of time to show you some of the things that I have brought up here today as some samples of what we've been talking about. And if you have questions, feel free to ask, and because I know there are other experts here, they'll be glad to answer those for you. But before I close, I want you to also be aware that one of the finest pottery displays anywhere to be found is located here in the Lincoln Parish Museum. Be sure to take a look at this exhibit as you go out here. It's exceptional. I've been to many Native American museums in the past, and pottery display is among the tops. And it was donated to the museum a number of years ago. Okay, I'm going to walk around just a little bit and show you a few things. Well, a couple of things I've got here. Material because it chips and flints. It chips. It's a big, so if you're in a field or sifting and you see hundreds of flakes and no arrowheads or one arrowhead, you might think, where are all the other arrowheads? Can you imagine how many little flakes it's going to take to produce one arrowhead? So
That is the material of arrowhead, so sturdy, it's sturdy enough to.
well, it's still the piece of material this size, and this is like an antler piece. Deer antler is hard, and again, they would use it just to flake and chip until they got what they wanted. They also own stones. I've tried chipping and flaking that much. And I have.
Okay, what?
Well, you know,
Little bitty.
the toe, they're small, but you know, they were again skilled hunters with a good bow, and these are about the size of a .22.
With that.
Corn or acre. Had to go to the woods out there and utilize whatever resources that were available. There's one other little stone here, and it has just a little small indention in it. And the reason for that, I know we probably don't try to eat or pick out hickory nuts ourselves, but if you hit one with a hammer, it's going to go like that all over the place. But if you have a little indention in your stone, and you can take another stone and whop it like that, it's going to crack and pretty much stay in place. They may have done the same thing with an acorn, or is another group. On the very top, if you come up, there's some that have a little flat top. With. But what they would do is to dig a small pit, build a fire in there, and they would get clay and form. Most of them, I mean, they're not ornate, but you can maybe see some little form on this, and you can come up and look at them later. And these are called clay balls, but they would fire these, and they're pretty hard, but they would just line the pit with these, and they would get hot, and then they'd lay the food on top of these clay balls to heat the food.
They were very resourceful.
Oh, absolutely. Let's see. I'm not going to pick it up. It's pretty heavy. But this one is a good example of some age diversity. In the top center, and I have it labeled, someone from Poverty Point helped me with this. I'm not that good of an expert. But these 2 points are called Evans points, and again identified by age and shape, about 4,000 years old. In the corners are some bird points or augers or drills that are maybe 800 years old. In the bottom, which is probably the prize that I have, if you'll see along this bottom row, there's a progression of bead making from the rough out stone to a little bit smoother to a little bit smoother to the last one is a completed bead that's about 2 inches long. And also here, these 3 are called by the shape of the stone, the shape of the projectile point, Dalton point, which means that they're about 8,000 years old, or 8,000 BC, or 10,000 years old, probably the oldest thing that I have. This one is found, again, I told you about that place in Sterlington that I went. I had made several trips up there, but there's some real good examples of scrapers, and they use scrapers a lot when they would harvest an animal, take the skin off. In order to preserve the skin, make clothing, it takes a lot of scraping of the membrane off the inside of that skin. And so scrapers were used quite a bit. Just a couple of more that I mentioned. I put together just a few of these pieces of pottery. You can see that there's some decorating on here, some where they've drawn lines in there before it was fired or hardened. And someone identified for me these came from the Coles Creek culture. I'll take their word for it. Most everything over here I've kept separate is from North Louisiana. I did bring a couple of examples of some projectile points other than that. I was invited some years ago to go deer hunting in Texas, and I'm not a big deer but I was sitting up in the deer stand, and as it started getting daylight, I started seeing all these shiny things on the ground under there. Well, I got down out of that deer stand, and I started looking around, and ended up finding a couple of pockets full of arrowheads there, and also there are some scrapers, and I think on the bottom side probably were used more as like we would consider a knife. You know, most of the times we think of the knife as something with a nice handle on it and long blade, but they used like a handheld blade in some cases. But I did bring that as well. These were right on the close to the Mexican border, probably belonged to the Apaches. This one is a nice grouping of arrowheads, and I found these in southeast Arkansas, outside of Montrose, on a river up there. And this is the place where I went probably 6 or 8 times, and 2 or 3 times took a family member that never went back with me because it was pretty rigorous effort to get there. But these are of the approximate age as Poverty Point. And actually, if you look on a map where these were found, Poverty Point and this place near Montrose, less than 100 miles apart.
Where's the first one you found when you were 8?
I don't have them in a frame. The first one I found was actually, I was living in a little town in Texas called Texas. It's Robstown, maybe 15, 20 miles from Padre Island. And on weekends, sometime as a family would go out to Padre Island. Now, I've not been to Padre Island since about 1951, but I understand now there's high-rise condos and all of that. When we went to Padre Island, there was a narrow 2-lane road to get you there and nothing but sand dunes. But in between some of those sand dunes, back off of toward the bayside, were windswept areas where the ground was bare, no sand, and that's where you find those points. Okay. I've got just a couple of other little things, kind of fun things to show you, some that I actually made myself. Maybe after the French and Spaniards came through 400 or 500 years ago, 300 years ago, they left some metal with them, and for the first time, our Native Americans had access to something other than stone. And they would have made something like this called an adze, and it's just a small blade, and it would be used maybe to hollow out for a dugout canoe, in addition to burning process. They would burn, char it, and then scrape it here. And that's what I think you get something. And this is what made me think of that. If you think about leverage, if I'm going to throw this tennis ball, if I hold my wrist perfectly still, I'm not going to be able to throw it very far like that. If I hold it down here, I get a little bit further. If you can let me get all the way back here, I can throw it a little bit further. So I'm increasing my leverage, okay? These guys were smart. This is before the bow and arrow, several thousand years ago, and was commonly used, and a lot of evidence of this in Poverty Point. They used what's called an atlatl. and it's simply a stick like this that they would carve, and with a piece of cane hooked on the end there, and hold it, and then look at the leverage I have by the time I get my full extension, and when this is going out, I've got a lot of leverage, and so it can go a greater distance with a greater force. And I spent a couple of days at Poverty Point with the Rangers one time, and we had some demonstrations, and they allowed us to try to practice with the atlatl. And sometimes it would go straight down, sometimes straight up. But the Rangers, who were pretty good, they would put a box or target out there, maybe 40 feet away, and they could put it in there pretty good. So we know that if your life depended on it, you would learn to do pretty good with an atlatl. But
They like to kill deer or bear or whatever. Do you think?
anything they could. Yeah. Anything they could. And I'm not saying much of this, I was told about it. They go to Lowe's and get what they use. But they did have their own ingenuity here. This is a drill that they possibly would have made. There's a drill bit, if you will. There's a stone, a piece of flint that's been chipped into a shape there and inserted into there. And with the weights there, we can make this work. Let's see, I've got it twisted up here. But anyway, it will go up and down like that. Even with that little bit, I put two little holes in there, and again, very industrious, very ingenious. I did bring, like I said, I don't know a lot of it because I like to leave that to the professionals, but even the professional archaeologist would use a screen maybe similar to this. And like I said, there's been a couple of dump truck loads of dirt that have gone through this. You put a shovel full or two in and back and forth, and I'm going to put something underneath here, but I'll leave it out. Maybe after an hour or so of work, you may come up with some maybe and that's a little bit of show and tell. If you have questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them for you. And if you want to come up and look at these a little more closely, you're certainly welcome to. You can pick up the stone. I would ask that you not maybe pick up the large cases. Some of them are kind of heavy. Yes, ma'am.
Would you be able to do the drill bit? I would try the drill bit.
Sure, I'll try that again in a minute. Yeah. See if I can get it done. It was kind of twisted up in the top. And Jim?
Rodney, we just have one question. We just want to know the coordinates for his best deal.
That's the thing about Airhead. Like, Jim and I have been a bunch of places together. He knows a few places that he won't tell me about. I know a couple of places that I won't tell him about. So it's kind of like fishing, If you're fishing with a buddy, that's fine. But every now and then you have your own little place that you kind of hold
It's
there.
like big bucks and big turkeys. You better keep your mouth shut.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
I don't want to tell you how to do it.
Indian village? Were there Indian villages in 1860?
You know, that's kind of east of here. I know there's one out that way, and I don't know if it got its name because there was a village site there and it just kind of maintained that name, but to specifically answer your question, I really don't know. What I have learned, though, is that because of the westward expansion of Europeans, of the new Americans coming in, we pretty much shut them out to the ones who were natives here. As I said, there were several thousand Caddos here. First pushed them into Texas, then into Oklahoma, and so many of them were either pushed out, or another really tragic thing we brought to them was disease, smallpox, and other European diseases that they had no immunity to. So there may have been a few remnants. In some of the French journals that I was reading, some of the French explorers actually married some of the Native Americans that they came in contact with. So there may have been a little of that. I don't
We know how they handle burials or anything like that, or what they did for the rituals, or we know anything about it all.
You know, different cultures did it different ways. I know down south of here, outside of Podge on the Doug DeMona, I was with a group that was doing some digging and sifting, and we came upon a burial, and so we stopped. I'm kind of sensitive to digging in the graveyard, so we stopped, and so there is that. I had read that some did cremations, usually an elevated cremation, and the bones were buried. Can't think of the name of the site, somewhere outside of Natchitoches, where there was a professional archaeological excavation. They did find a number of burials there. So it's, I don't think there's any one thing that you can say, yeah, they all did this. It's kind of culturally diverse.
Yeah, Al and I was at Poverty Point, if I remember correctly, there was something said about tribes from as far away as Michigan migrating down in here every so often for some kind of ritual. Do you know anything about that?
I know it was a ceremonial site. Now, I don't know the details about the rituals because there's no, we think that it was this, what they call the bird mound, the one that was 70 feet tall and 700 feet long. Can you imagine building something 70 feet high and 700 feet long, one basket at a time? It didn't have backhoes. So it was a ceremonial site, and because of the trading that went back and forth, I suspect that was the case.
I've also heard that when the government first moved into Poverty Point, or made some inclination toward that, it was not greeted with a whole lot of glee by the landowners over there.
Yeah.
To the point that one of them got out and got one of the mounds all the way down with his tractor.
Yeah.
Another one built his house on top of one after he smoothed it out.
Yeah. Jim, I think we were on one of the mounds when we used to up there. Well, and of course, if you were a farmer and your livelihood depended on cotton and keeping that, yeah, they probably plowed it down because that interfered with their cotton growing. But I've not heard about a vindictive thing. It was more of their own livelihood.
You know how people are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Would this be considered an arrowhead?
Pardon?
Found that in our yard. Never never been able to find anybody to tell us about it.
Okay. You know, from this, I can't tell a lot of detail, but it looks like a type of material would be used perhaps in making an arrowhead. Here at the museum, I think, Rick, in the back area, a Heritage Day or Heritage Week. And I know there are going to be a number of different demonstrations going on, and I have been asked to do a flint knapping demonstration then, and I know some of you are also flint knappers, probably better than I am, so come join me and we can take turns.
When will that be?
I don't know, it's a fall date. Rick, do you know the date of the
Follow us on Facebook, stay informed.
commercial break? Okay, other questions? I tell you, if you want to come up and look or ask other questions, feel free to do so. I want to thank you for letting me share my passion and admiration for the people who lived on this land hundreds and thousands of years ago.